Well, good evening, everyone. Welcome back. How did you sleep last night? Yeah. I gained on it a little bit. I went to bed early, real early for me, 11. So, yeah, I guess I need a little bit more work. But I was up at 5 this morning. I usually try to get up between 5 and 5:30. And, because when the house is real quiet, that's the best time to spend with the Lord. But I've got to get on the front end, because every hour is worth two. So I try to do that. So welcome back for this evening's presentation. I want to go ahead and do our drawing. And I have, what's that? You? I'm not a good drawer. No, I've just done it. Unless you want me to put this one back. Sorry. It's my mother, Barbara. Barbara. All right. And we only have one drawing tonight. Yeah, I don't know what it is, but it felt heavy, the kind of thing you'd want to get at Christmas time. So congratulations to you. So we learned on the first evening that Dr. Emerson is graduated from medical school in what year? Who remembers? 1985? Nope. 1988, you got it right. Okay. Has he only practiced in this country or has he practiced elsewhere? He's practiced in quite a few different places. How many children does he have? Two children. Who's older, the boy or the girl? The girl is older. What's his favorite color? Blue. You guys were really listening. That's great. So, Dr. Emerson, if you'd come on up, I just got a question that I'd like to ask you. And, so many doctors, they go into private practice and they make a lot of money doing that. And but I'm just wondering what shifted you into lifestyle medicine, which is kind of up and coming, and it's not a very lucrative field. So why do you do what you do?
I was between patients, and God talked to me, and He talks to all of us. He said, Dave, what you're doing is not much different than the Dark Ages. And I said, oh, the Dark Ages, how so? He says, well, in the Dark Ages, people committed sin, they were still troubled, and they went to the priest, and they said, Father, I have sinned, and the priest would say, okay, do 12 Hail Marys, do some penance, and that was supposed to absolve them. Or they could buy an indulgence. And they could actually buy an indulgence for sins they were planning to commit. And of course, that sparked the Protestant Reformation. Luther said, no, if you want forgiveness, you got to repent. And it's a free gift. You can't pay for it. He says, I know that's what happened in the Dark Ages. What's that got to do with me? He says, well, Dave, people are in a lifestyle destroying their health. They feel troubled about it, so they come see you, and you write them an indulgence. A prescription, which allows them to continue on the lifestyle that's destroying their health. And I said, oh, so you want me to help them make a change? And he said, yeah, you got it. So I think, okay, is this God talking to me, or is this just, my thoughts? Well, the next thing convinced me, I pull up next chart. Tom, I saw him 2 weeks ago, lifestyle issues. I showed him how he could change his lifestyle and get off his medications, have better health. I'm going to see how Tom's doing. That was 2 weeks ago. So I open the door. So I say, so Tom, how's the lifestyle going? Hangs his head. He says, Father, I have sinned. Doctor. And I said, this isn't a confessional. So yeah, I do feel Thomas Edison said that, the doctors of the future will actually educate people on how to be healthy rather than prescriptions. And so I do think that's where many physicians are heading at this point. I think God's moving people in that direction. And so it's a good thing.
All right, Dr. Emerson.
All righty.
One more thing.
That's all righty. So we're going to we want to actually talk about how how a fever can turn on your immune system to help you fight infections and cancer. Normally this is a 2-hour thing, but we've just kind of condensed it. So we're just going to hit the high points tonight. So I always like to start with a prayer. Dear Father in heaven, I pray you can be with us, that we look at the wonderful gift you've given us in the form of fever. We pray that you can be with us as we see the benefits of fever and how it can help us fight infections and cancers. We ask this in Jesus' name. Amen. Okay, so, I didn't have it here, sorry. Oh, I thought that was already set. That's not right. Okay. So we're going to ask in this talk, can a suppressed immune system open the door to cancer? And if so, can stimulating the immune system help you fight cancers? Then we're going to ask, in the setting of infections, is a natural fever helpful or harmful? And if it's helpful, then can we generate a fever to help fight infections and possibly cancers? Then we're going to look at exactly how a fever stimulates or turns on the immune system. And then we're going to say, well, if fevers help fight infections, can they help fight cancers? So we're going to be looking at some of the evidence, really what's been tried in the past and what they're actually doing today. So every day we're exposed to bacteria and viruses, pathogens, and an immune system handles those in the background. And every day you're creating 5 or 6 new cancer cells, and your immune system handles them in the background. Occasionally, an infection or a cancer gets a foothold, and your immune system has to get stimulated to address it. So the question then is, can a weak immune system open the door to cancer? What's the evidence? You may have heard of Burkitt's lymphoma. Who's the man behind the name? He was actually a surgeon. In college, he had college Bible studies, and he became a Christian then, gave his heart to the Lord, and felt called to serve him in Africa as a surgeon under the employ of the African government. And there he was introduced to Burkitt's lymphoma, which eventually came to bear his name, cancer that would affect kids. And he took safaris all over Africa and found that it only happened in the tropical belt where you had malaria. And where you didn't have malaria, you didn't have the Burkitt's lymphoma. And this seemed a bit odd. And so throughout the course, kind of a longer story, but they found that it was caused by a virus, Epstein-Barr virus. And they thought, well, if it happens in malarial areas, it's probably a virus transmitted by a mosquito from one person to another. But then they found that 85% of Americans had Epstein-Barr virus antibodies that had been exposed to it, but they didn't have the cancer. So why did the people in Africa, when they got Epstein-Barr virus, why did some of them get cancer? And through a lot of research, they actually found what the trigger was. It turned out that when you have malaria long term, by the way, if you get Epstein-Barr virus here as an adult or a teenager, you get mononucleosis. So why does it cause mononucleosis here and cancer in some of the people in Africa? Reason is in Africa, if you have malaria and you have it your whole life there in Africa, your immune system is so busy keeping the malaria under control, it has nothing left to keep the virus under control, and it can progress to the lymphoma that they see. And so it was an immunosuppression situation that was allowing the Epstein-Barr virus to progress to the cancer. Other forms of immunosuppression will cause cancer. HIV is a virus which kills your soldier cells, your CD4 lymphocytes. And in those cancers, or in that situation, you can get Kaposi sarcoma, non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, and cervical carcinoma. You're at increased risk of getting those because your immune system's suppressed. Other forms of immunosuppression, if you get a kidney transplant, we have to intentionally suppress your immune system so that you don't attack the kidney as a foreign organ. And when we do that, you are at risk for getting cancers because we've suppressed your immune system. These are the cancers that you can get. Kaposi sarcoma, you're at increased risk of getting 61 times more likely to get it if you have immunosuppression compared to those that don't have immunosuppression. And there's a whole list of cancers that you're increased risk of getting if you have immunosuppression. And lastly, the other situation we have immunosuppression is autoimmune diseases. If you've got an autoimmune disease, it's attacking your healthy organs. Typically, will suppress the immune system to prevent the immune system from attacking your kidneys or your joints or whatever organ is being involved. One of the common ones is, and this is one example, it's a infliximab. It's an immunosuppressant, and it can put you at risk for Hodgkin's lymphoma, non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, and a variety of other malignancies. So if a suppressed immune system, as we've just seen, can cause or allow cancer to progress, can we use fever to stimulate the immune system to help prevent or fight a cancer? Well, to answer this, we have to first look at, can fevers aid the body in fighting infections? And if so, can they help us fight cancers? Have you ever known somebody that had a fever, grown up with a fever, gotten a fever? Yeah, it's pretty common. Many times, antipyretics are given. Those are anti-fever medications, aspirin, Tylenol, are given to suppress the fever. And the question is, why do we do that? Well, this is because today, fever is seen as something that needs to be suppressed. You're not a good mother or you're not a good nurse if you don't suppress the fever. However, in the past, it was actually seen as something beneficial. When did the attitude change from fevers being beneficial to fevers being harmful? Actually, it changed in the 1950s with the invention of aspirin. I'll give you some clue as to how the change came about. But in his book, Kluger, in the 1970s, documented many animal studies showing the beneficial effect of fevers, difference between life and death in animals if they were allowed to have a fever or if they gave an artificial fever to animals that wouldn't normally have a fever, like newborn puppies or other mammals, like newborn mice even. Now, today, however, there is a widespread trend to reduce all fevers with antipyretics. And Kluger, who wrote the book there, said one might surmise from this widespread attempt to reduce fevers that convincing evidence had been presented which demonstrated the fevers were harmful. This is not the case. If anything, the weight of evidence tends to support the opposite conclusion. What is some of the evidence showing the beneficial effects of fever? He said basically that fevers are beneficial. So what's the evidence? Well, some of the first evidence came from Louis Pasteur in the late 1800s. He was trying to develop the anthrax vaccine, and he found that he could inoculate cows and sheep with anthrax, and they would get disease and death within a few days. However, if he injected it into the chickens, they would ignore it. Well, he told a colleague this, and his colleague said, I can give anthrax to chickens, but when he tried, he couldn't either. But then
Pasteur said, I have found a way to give anthrax to chickens. The stunned colleague said, how did you do it? He says, well, you notice that chickens had temperatures 104 to 107 degrees Fahrenheit. And he thought, well, cows, they only have a temperature of about 100.4 degrees. He thought maybe the higher temperature in the chickens was protecting them from the anthrax. So he did an experiment. He took a chicken and he put it in a cooling bath, lowered its temperature down to around 100.4. That's what cows run. And then he injected it with anthrax. And within 24 hours, the chicken got anthrax symptoms and died. Wow. Then he said he took another chicken and put it in a cooling bath, injected it with anthrax. In a few hours, he had anthrax symptoms, kind of swaying back and forth in the cooling bath, listless, weak. At that point, he took him out of the cooling bath, and he dried him off, and he warmed him up, and dried him off, warmed him up, and then the chicken survived. Then he took another chicken, no cooling bath, injected him with anthrax, no symptoms at all, and that chicken also survived. So a few degrees Celsius made the difference between life and death in chickens getting anthrax. That was pretty remarkable. Hippocrates, also another striking example, showed that there was a progressive paralysis at that time, around 400 BC, they noted. And this progressive paralysis would leave the victims paralyzed. And it's probably the cause of the paralysis we read about in the New Testament at that time as well. However, he observed in rare cases, if they got a fever from some other cause, that many times they would get a remission or a cure from this paralysis. Well, it wasn't until about 2,000 years later, in 1858, that Esmark and Jensen showed that this progressive paralysis was caused by a spirochete called syphilis, and they called it neurosyphilis. Well, a few years later, 30 years later, in 1887, Wagner Jarig was a psychiatrist studying neurosyphilis, and he noted that in China and India, syphilis was rampant, but they very rarely got the neurosyphilis. And then he wondered why. Well, then he also noted that malaria was rampant in China and India, and he thought, I wonder, remembering back on Hippocrates' statement that sometimes the paralysis would go away if they got a fever, he said, I wonder if the fevers from malaria are protecting them from the syphilis. So he came up with a plan. He says, what if I take someone with neurosyphilis and give them malaria? Then I might change an incurable disease like neurosyphilis into a curable one like malaria, which can be treated with quinine. So he took 9 patients with neurosyphilis. He injected them all with malarial blood, and 3 of the 9 had practically complete resolution of the symptoms. His success led to treatment of thousands of neurosyphilis patients. Before malarial treatment, there was only a 1% neurosyphilis patient remission. But with the malarial treatments, it rose to about 30%. And this was on sample size of thousands of patients. And you might say, well, that sounds kind of like malpractice, giving malaria to people. But someone didn't think so, because in 1927, he got the Nobel Prize in Medicine or Physiology for treating neurosyphilis with malarial fever treatments. Now, this is a review of the studies, the animal studies Kluger did. I usually go through these, but we don't have time to go through all the animal studies. But in these studies, it was very clear that when animals were infected with a lethal pathogen, that if they were allowed to have a fever, their survival rate jumped markedly. And here's another human study. It's called Fever in the Intensive Care Unit. This was done January 2012. And the purpose was to determine if fever could save lives in infected patients admitted to the intensive care unit. They studied 130,000 patients in Australia, New Zealand, and England with the diagnosis of infection that were admitted to the intensive care unit. And they did something interesting. They looked on the past records, and they looked at the first 24 hours. They looked for the peak temperature that they got in the first 24 hours. And what did they find? Well, what they found is that the adjusted in-hospital mortality risk progressively decreased with increasing peak temperatures in patients with infections. The lowest risk of death was around 102 to 103 degrees Fahrenheit. It actually decreased the risk of death. That is, with an infection, the higher the peak temperature, the lower the mortality. And why the benefit? Well, it turns out that temperatures turn on or stimulate the immune system to fight infections. More on that later. We're going to find out how they do that. But in patients that did not have an infection, in other words, they're admitted to the intensive care unit, the higher the peak temperature in non-infected patients, the higher their mortality. You think, why was that? Well, what happens is the highest mortality is around 102 degrees Fahrenheit. When no infection is present, peak temperatures that were high increase mortality. Why? Well, what they found is that when you have a high fever, your metabolism is racing. It's like climbing a mountain or running a race. And you're burning up your energy reserves. And when you burn up your energy reserves more quickly, it increases your chances of mortality when you don't have an infection. But when you do have an infection, that increased metabolic rate, even though you're burning up your reserves faster, the benefit of it turning on your immune system outweighs the harm in burning up your reservoirs, and it actually has a beneficial effect. And that's what they found in those studies. So now we ask, well, how does the body actually generate a fever in the first place? And then once we learn how the body generates a fever, we're going to find out, well, how does that fever actually turn on the immune system? By the way, the fact that there is a mechanism to generate a fever, as Christians, we understand God put systems in place for our benefit. And the fact that there is a system in place to generate a fever would imply that it's there for a good reason. This is the mechanism. In the center, you see a white cell, and it has little receptors on it, and these receptors will sense if there is a bacteria present. This on the left is E. coli, and it has a liposaccharide endotoxin on the cell surface. That's an antigen that white cell can recognize. On the right is a gram-positive bacteria with another antigen on it. These bacteria are so common that you are born with these receptors that already know how to recognize these bacteria. If a virus or a bacteria, a new one is developed that your body has never seen before, it has an adaptive immunity that it can eventually get receptors that recognize those bacteria. That's adaptive. That takes a couple days. But this is innate. You're born with that, and that happens very quickly. And that's one of the advantages. But once you adapt and make cells that can adapt to new bacteria, then the next time you get infected, you get an immediate response. And that's because you have learned how to handle that kind of bacteria. So watch here. When those bacteria bind to the white cell, the white cell says, we've been invaded, and it releases pyrogenic cytokines. This is Greek. Pyro is fire. Genic is to produce. It produces a fire or a fever. These on the left are the pyrogenic cytokines that are produced when you are infected. These then produce prostaglandins. By the way, that's how aspirin works. It prevents you from producing prostaglandins, and it stops this process from happening. That's how it causes its antipyrogenic or anti-fever effect. The prostaglandins then go to your hypothalamus, and your hypothalamus then turns up your thermostat in your brain. And now your thermostat is increased. How does this play out in a real live person? Well, when you get infected, your body senses it and resets your thermostat up to, say, 102. But you're still at 98.6. So you feel cold because your temperature is not at your new thermostat set point. So you put on a blanket, you start shivering to generate heat. The blood vessels on the surface of your skin constrict to drive blood deeper into the tissues to conserve heat. And that allows your body temperature to rise up to 102. When you hit 102, you feel comfortable because your temperature is now matched your thermostat. But someone touching you says, "You're burning up. Don't you feel hot?" And you say, "Well, actually, no, you don't." Now, you will feel exhausted because at that higher temperature, again, you are burning calories faster, you're burning oxygen faster, your heart's racing. That's the discomfort that comes from a fever. It's not a temperature discomfort. Now, when you clear your infection, the thermostat is reset back down to 98.6. Now your temperature is exceeding your thermostat. Now how do you feel? Hot or cold? Hot, exactly. Your temperature is exceeding your thermostat. So you throw off the blanket, you break out in a sweat, your blood vessels in the skin dilate, you become a rosy pink, you release heat, and your temperature comes down. In the old days, the parents would, when their kids had a fever, they would watch for the sweat. They knew that their kid was going to get better. There were different ways of doing this, of generating. You can actually generate an artificial fever if you got a cold. Thrasher showed us how to do that. I remember in residency, I got a viral infection. So I got my T-shirt and I put it under water, I wrung it out, put the T-shirt on. Then I got a trash bag, cut the holes for the head and the arms, put that on. And then I put a wool sweater on over that, and oh, it felt wonderful. And I went to sleep. It felt wonderful till about 2 in the morning. All of a sudden I said, "Yuck, this is hot. This is horrible." And I had to take it off because my thermostat had reset down to 98.6. I had cleared the infection, and the next day I felt great. It was gone. That's a simple way of doing a fever bath. You can do a fever bath in your bathtub with hot water, and there are ways of doing that as well. So now, are fevers helpful? Well, yes, they are, but why? The first thought was that, well, maybe fevers cook the bacteria. They get it hot enough to kill the bacteria. Well, that might be true for gonococci. Gonococci are killed at temperatures around 104 degrees Fahrenheit. And physiologic temperatures, that is the temperatures you generate yourself, can get that high. But that's not true for syphilis. Syphilis, you need temperatures of 106 to kill syphilis or higher. And physiologic temperatures don't get that high. But if you remember, Wagner-Jauregg, he was able to treat neurosyphilis with malarial fevers, which weren't getting that high. So why were they getting better? Well, they were getting better, we understand, because that fever was turning on the immune system, and the immune system was what was killing the spirochetes. So how exactly do fevers stimulate the immune system? Well, these are T lymphocytes. These are your soldier cells. They help fight infections. They also stimulate the B cells to produce antibodies, which also help you fight infections. And when you are infected, interleukins will produce and stimulate T lymphocyte production. You're making soldier cells faster. But if these interleukins, that's if they're at 98.6, the interleukins will do that. But if the interleukins are working in a febrile environment at 102, they will produce lymphocytes 4 to 10 times faster. And that's how a fever actually helps you produce lymphocytes more quickly. Now, T cell lymphocytes, when they are activated, because they've sensed a bacteria present, they will stimulate the B cells, and the B cells will produce antibodies. And if these T cells are activated at 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit, they produce antibodies. But if these T cells are activated at 102 degrees, those T lymphocytes are much more effective in stimulating the B cells, and those activated B cells will produce 9.3 times more antibodies to help you fight infections. Here's an interferon. Interferons have antibacterial, antiviral, and anti-cancer effects. These are much more powerful and effective at higher temperatures than at normal body temperatures. Interferons can slow viral growth, and they do it more effectively at higher temperatures. Here we see viral growth decreased at 37 degrees. This is body temperature here. But if the interferon is working at a febrile temperature, 102 to 104, it slows the viral growth even more effectively. Now, this is a logarithmic scale, so that's really not half, that's about 5 times slower, because it's logarithmic. Here's another method that fevers enhance. This is an electron microscope. This is a macrophage in the purple, and it's gobbling up 2 bad guys, the methicillin-resistant Staph aureus in yellow. When it gobbles them up, it encases them in a bubble called a phagosome, and the bacteria can actually be alive in that phagosome. So the body has to produce another bubble or lysosome with toxic chemicals in it, and the lysosome combines with the phagosome and injects its toxic chemicals into the phagosome, and that's what actually kills these Staph aureus bacteria. What happens is these macrophages have to go around and gobble up bacteria. At higher temperatures, their speed is increased. This shows the speed of those macrophages as you go from, say, 37 to 38 or higher temperatures. The higher the temperature, the faster the macrophages go, and enables them to gobble up bacteria faster. Another thing that fevers do is when you get a fever, the white cells release a substance which takes iron out of the blood, the free iron out of the blood, and stores it as ferritin. You think, well, so why do you do that? Well, because many bacteria, like Salmonella bacteria, this causes typhoid fever, need bacteria to grow and develop. So if you get a fever, your serum iron level will drop, and you'll starve these Salmonella bacteria. And that's another way in which fevers help you fight infections. So, if fevers can help you fight infections, can they help you fight cancer? Well, take a look. Here's an amazing article. This is called Fever, Cancer Incidence, and Spontaneous Remissions. It first describes the mechanisms by which fevers fight viruses, or help your body fight infections and viruses. Then it reads, fever enhances this process in vivo, confirming the popular belief of the virtues of fever. And then he mentions what we just covered. He says, how do fevers help you fight? It says, a rise in temperature during a fever establishes a cascade of host defense mechanisms that increase host survival. And it induces T cell proliferation. That means the T cells are being produced faster. And differentiation. They grow to adulthood faster in the fever. Secretion of interferons. Remember, those have anti-tumor effects. You've got more of those. Antibodies, remember, fevers were able to allow the B cells to produce more antibodies. And neutrophil migration. This is the macrophages moving faster to catch the bacteria. He lists all of those that we've just discussed. But then the review launches into its real topic, and it's entitled Fever, Cancer Incidence, and Spontaneous Remissions. It starts off by noting a relationship between fever in childhood and cancer later in adulthood. It says if you get a fever as a child, you have less risk of getting it as an adult. Interesting. How did they come to that conclusion? Data reviewed in this topic support earlier observations on the topic that the occurrence of fever in childhood or adulthood may protect against later onset of malignant disease. Clinical oncologists repeatedly report that cancer patients stress in their history they've never been ill before the onset of cancer. As a result of this observation, a number of epidemiological studies had been conducted, and they mentioned 4 different researchers that showed an association between fever in childhood and decreased risk of cancer later in adulthood. Individuals who have never experienced febrile infections are 2.5 to 46 times more likely to have developed cancer than those who had febrile infections. He then goes on to show a strong association between childhood fevers and decreased cancer risk. These are 10 different studies that documented that association. There was only one study that showed no association between fevers. What is the mechanism by which a fever in childhood helps you later? Well, it's believed that when you get a fever in childhood, you're exercising your immune system. You're making it stronger so that later in life it's more capable of handling cancer cells or when they arise. But what if you already have cancer? Do fevers play a role here? Citing 5 references, he notes, additionally, febrile infections have been shown to increase the survival expectancy in cancer patients. So if you got cancer and you get fever, it would prolong your life, is what they found. One example, Trian and Broitman, they described post-transfusional hepatitis as a common complication in patients with acute myelogenous leukemia, and one was paradoxically prolonged survival. What he's saying is, in acute myelogenous leukemia, your marrow is crowded out by the cancer cells, and it can't produce red cells, so you get anemic. And so we treat you by giving you a transfusion. But back then, we couldn't screen for some of the viral hepatitises, and we could give you viral hepatitis, which is something you don't want to do, but when it did happen, it created a fever and paradoxically prolonged their survival. Presumably because the virus stimulated your immune system, which then fought the virus and the cancer and prolonged life. Then they looked at spontaneous remissions. Now, spontaneous remission, what is that? Well, that's when the cancer goes away for no known treatment and no known reason. The author notes that spontaneous remissions are often preceded by a feverish infection. Interesting. Now, what evidence brought him to that conclusion? Spontaneous remissions during or following feverish infections had been reported previously at the beginning of the 19th century. The author then lists 17 studies making this observation. He writes, there are several older reports of spontaneous remissions as well as recent studies by several authors. Remissions of leukemia following systemic infections have been noted throughout this century. Stephenson reported that an infection or persistent fever preceded 224 cases of spontaneous remissions. In reviewing cases of spontaneous remissions, he found a significant percent of them were preceded by a fever. So he looked at all the cases of spontaneous remissions, and then he noted that analysis literature reveals that feverish infection associated with remission of 22% of the leukemia cases. In other words, when you had leukemia, when there was a spontaneous remission, 22% of them were preceded by a fever, followed by 15% of cancers of the bone and connective tissue, 11% of the melanoma cases, and 7% of the lymphoma cases. He cites another study regarding metastatic melanoma, a deadly cancer. He states, finally, in a recent monograph, Spontaneous Remissions of Malignant Melanoma, Maurer and Como listed 21 cases from the world literature in which febrile infections had been associated with spontaneous regression of metastatic melanoma. And here is a a whole list of tumor types and the studies which showed spontaneous remissions following a fever. And if you add them all up, there are 90 references in all associating a fever with spontaneous remissions. The author concludes, the connection of febrile infection and tumor regression is the most frequent association found in the literature. So, what do we know about fevers so far? They stimulate the body's immune system to fight viruses and bacteria. Fevers in childhood are associated with decreased risk of cancer in adulthood. Fevers in cancer patients are associated with prolonged survival. Fevers are often associated with spontaneous remissions in cancers. So, well then, what about inducing a fever to produce a remission? Well, he says this statement, a very strong statement. He says, pyrogenic substances are more, and the more recent use of whole-body hyperthermia to mimic physiologic response to fever have successfully been administered in palliative and curative treatment protocols for metastatic cancer. Now, he says palliative and curative treatment. I didn't say that. I'm just a messenger. That's what he's saying. Well, let's look at the evidence here. We're going to look at the work of William Coley, the father of immunotherapy. And who was he? He was an orthopedic surgeon. You say, wait a minute. How did an orthopedic surgeon get involved with immunotherapy? Well, this was back in the late 1800s. He was the leading bone surgeon at the New York Hospital in the late 1800s. By the way, it's no longer known as the New York Hospital. It's the Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center, world-famous cancer center. 1890, he was presented with 17-year-old girl, Elizabeth Danshill. Now, who was she? She was the confidant and close friend of J.D. Rockefeller Jr., the son of the oil magnate. Tragically, she developed a sarcoma, a type of cancer in her hand. At that time, about all they could do for cancer was amputation and morphine. Despite amputation of the hand, the cancer spread, and she died. Now, deeply troubled by this, Dr. Coley searched for better methods of treating sarcoma. He found 90 or so records of similar cases. The case of Fred Stein was striking. In 1884, he was considered terminal, requiring, he had a terminal cheek sarcoma. They do surgery, it kept coming back. They had 4 surgeries, it kept coming back. He was considered terminal. Then he developed a postoperative skin infection with Streptococcus pyogenes, called erysipelas, accompanied by a high fever. Now, that could be lethal back then. It was one of the chief reasons for death after surgery was these post-op infections. He got high fevers, but surprisingly, he survived the infection. But even more surprising was his tumor started shrinking. His tumor eventually disappeared. He was discharged home. Now, Dr. Coley's reading about this case 6 years after it happened. And he says, this guy's still alive? So he tracks him down the Lower East Side of New York, and he's still alive. He examines him, photographs him. He still enjoyed excellent health. No evidence of cancer. A similar case was reported in 1868 in a German medical journal. This was where Dr. Bush, he noted a tumor resolved spontaneously after a high fever. So sometime thereafter, a girl came to her with a sarcoma in the cheek, about the size of a child's head, and a guy came to him with a Streptococcus pyogenes infection. So, taking his cue from this previous case of a tumor resolving spontaneously after infection, he burned a hole in the tumor, in the skin, into the tumor, took the pus from the guy with the infection, put it on the tumor. The girl developed the infection. The tumor shrunk. She got a fever, shrunk to the size of a small apple. But then she got septic. They had to back off on the infection. And when she overcame the infection, the tumor grew back. And then they lost her to follow-up. So on further searching, Dr. Coley found 38 cancer patients that acquired accidental or intentional Streptococcus pyogenes infections with fevers. In 12, the cancer disappeared, and in others, significantly improved. Thus encouraged, in 1891, Dr. Coley treated Mr. Zola. He was an Italian immigrant. He had a large sarcoma on his neck, size of and an egg-sized metastasis in his right tonsil. He'd had 2 surgeries. He could barely swallow or speak. He couldn't eat solid food. He was losing muscle mass, essentially wasting away. So, over the next 5 months, using cultured Streptococcus pyogenes, he, increasing doses, injected the tonsil every 3 to 4 days. He noted transient decrease in size, then it would grow back. Finally, he was able to produce a temperature of about 102. Both tumors decreased in size, and Mr. Zola could eat again. Then he contacted Dr. Koch, Robert Koch, in Germany, a bacteriologist there, and he got Streptococcus pyogenes from him, which was more virulent, directly injected it into the tumor. He developed more marked fever, about 105 degrees Fahrenheit, nausea, vomiting, severe pain. It almost killed him. But 12 hours after the injection, the skin infection covered the tumor in the neck, his face, and head. But then the tumor got paler, softer. By the second day, the tumor started breaking down and discharging caseous material for the next 10 days. By 2 weeks, the tumor could not be seen, and, where are we? They couldn't see the tumor, and the tonsillar metastasis had stopped growing. He lived another 8 years before dying of a recurrence. Now, using living bacterial, Dr. Coley treated 10 patients with inoperable cancer. 2 died due to erysipelas infections that raged out of control. 4 patients received repeated injections, but no full erysipelas, and had only temporary partial regressions, and 4 patients developed full erysipelas infection followed by remission. They were cured. So in order to reduce the risk of sepsis, he used heat-inactivated cancer. In other words, bacteria. He would heat the bacteria up, kill the bacteria, but it was still pyrogenic. It would still induce a fever when injected into the patients. He also found that if you add another bacteria, Serratia marcescens, it was even more able to produce fevers. Using Dr. Coley's methods, Dr. Calkins, Watertown, New York, and Montagne from Belgium both had a large number of successes. Throughout his 40-year career, he treated hundreds of cancer patients with various versions of his mixed bacterial vaccines. Some were cured, others were not. 1934, Coley presented 44 cases of Ewing sarcoma. 12 were treated with radiation by other physicians. None survived 5 years. The 32 that were treated with bacterial extract by Dr. Coley, about 38% were surviving 5 years or more. So we had 0% survival versus 38% survival with Dr. Coley's treatments. 1936, Dr. Coley died, but his daughter, Helen Coley-Knotts, and Charles Stearns, an immunologist and oncology researcher, both reviewed Dr. Coley's cases. She tracked down most of the patients over the years and decades to document responses to therapy. 1953, Helen published 1,200 cancer cases treated with mixed bacterial vaccine. 270 patients, that is 22%, had inoperable cancer and achieved complete remission with no recurrences. 78% that were classified as failures actually had remission, but then it came back later on down the line. Several years later, 1959, a survey was done. It was published on all soft tissue sarcomas, and there was a cure rate of about 57%. And the 43% were considered failures. Many of them had remissions and then recurrences. They looked at then 170 cases of many different types of cancers. Remission rate was about 64%, 5-year survival about 44%. Dr. Coley's daughter, Helen Coley-Knotts, championed her father's pioneering efforts. In 1953, with a $2,000 grant, she, from Nelson Rockefeller, Helen Coley-Knotts, founded the New York Cancer Research Institute. Today, it awards millions of dollars in research grants annually. So, is hyperthermia being used today? Yes and no, just depends where you are and where you go. There's two kinds of hyperthermia. There's local hyperthermia, and there is whole body hyperthermia. Local hyperthermia is where you just treat it's like getting an abscess or a boil. That might become red and hot. That's like a local fever. Local hyperthermia, you just heat up the tumor itself, not the whole body. It's more comfortable, of course, you can imagine. In whole body hyperthermia, you heat up the whole body and generate a whole body fever. You say, well, wait a minute. If you got a tumor inside your abdomen or chest, how do you heat up the tumor inside your chest without heating up the whole body? Well, they use a BSD unit. It's a unit where you get on the unit, you go in, the MRI focuses on the tumor, and then microwaves focus on the tumor and heat up the tumor without heating up the rest of the body. And the nice thing about it is the MRI can actually then determine how hot you're getting the tumor and for how long you maintain it. These have been used successfully. In America, they are used in conjunction with chemotherapy. Dr. Mark Dewhurst, Duke University Medical Center, said in an interview that they are using it in conjunction with chemotherapy and radiation. He related that 8 to 10 randomized studies have shown that localized heat improved response to radiation in head and neck cancers, glioblastoma, melanoma, locally advanced cervical cancer, and local recurrences of breast and esophageal cancers. In Germany, the Charité Hospital in Berlin used this to treat cancers. Local heat was applied to deep tumors, and there was no small increase in response. At the hospital, Dr. Peter Wust, he said that a report from the cancer research indicates this doubles the rate of survival. When you add this to chemotherapy or anything, the 5-year survival rate doubles. Very impressive. It's also being used in China. Their response is similar. What does the research show when adding local heat to chemotherapy or radiation? Well, in China, they had 60 patients with non-small cell lung cancer, and when they added local hyperthermia, it increased the complete remission rate from 37% to 63%, and it increased the partial response from 40 to 70%. Head and neck tumors. Stage 4 head and neck cancer, adding hyperthermia to radiation improved tumor disappearance from 41% to 83%. It improved local relapse-free survival from 24% to 68%, and 5-year survival, 0% to 53%. Dramatic increase. Because of this, another study with pancreatic cancer. They do 2-year survivals with pancreatic cancer because very few live 5 years. 2-year survival, when you added hyperthermia to chemotherapy, rose from 19% to 36%, almost doubled. And in Kyoto, Japan, adding hyperthermia to chemotherapy, 1-year survival went from 30 to 49%. Because of this, Cancer Treatment Centers of America, now City of Hope, it was purchased by City of Hope, May 2007, the BSD units were introduced to the Cancer Treatment Centers of America, and of course they were pleased to welcome Cancer Treatment Centers of America as a new proponent of the hyperthermia therapy for cancer. Cancer Treatment Centers of America is nationally known for treating cancer patients with complex and advanced stage disease. We were excited to be providing the benefits of hyperthermia therapy to their patients. I called City of Hope trying to see if they're still doing the BSD units, but I couldn't get through to anybody there. It's not on their website. I'm not sure if it's still being offered there. Germany, however, well, what about whole body hyperthermia? Germany is doing that even today. They have in their constitution freedom of medical practice, where you can do things that are not maybe mainline in Germany if the patient and the physician agree to do it. And to do whole body hyperthermia, the initial belief was that we've got to get the temperature high enough to cook the cancer cells, to kill them through too much heat for them. To do this, the highest temperatures the body could withstand were generated. Germany, 1995, 103 patients previously treated with all conventional treatments were on a stage of uncontrollable progression with metastasis. They used infrared lamps, hyperthermia, at 107.6 degrees Fahrenheit under general anesthesia. You had to knock them out to get them that high. They couldn't tolerate it otherwise. And 50% had a positive therapeutic response. However, toxic effects occurred at this high temperature. I said, well, what were those toxic effects? Well, let's take a look. There was a study done in the Netherlands. They took 27 patients who were treated with whole-body hyperthermia alone or in combination with chemotherapy or radiotherapy. Whole-body hyperthermia was performed in the Pomp-Siemens cavern with hot air and warm air mattresses, patient being covered with a plastic film to avoid cooling and perspiration. By the way, they were anesthetized. They're under general anesthesia to make this happen. The heat treatment lasted for 2 hours at about 107.2 to 107.6. Toxicity such as liver damage, respiratory problems was considerable. There were 2 fatalities. Hyperthermia gave an improved therapeutic effect in 6 patients. Considerable pain relief was observed in 8 of the 10 patients. Whole body hyperthermia at 107.6 degrees can be effective, but the potential toxicity limits its use to those patients with severe complaints for whom there's no palliative treatment. Bottom line is, if they survived the hyperthermia, they had an improvement, okay? But they may not survive the treatment. Since then, we have found, as we mentioned earlier, that the benefit of a fever is not because it's cooking the bacteria or it's cooking the cancer cells, but that it's turning on your immune system. And for that, you don't need 107.5 degrees Fahrenheit. The current accepted treatment in people that use hyperthermia is a rectal temperature of 104 degrees Fahrenheit. But if you're in a water bath, it's kind of hard to do rectal temperatures. That translates to an oral temperature of about 103 or an axillary temperature of about 102. Whole body hyperthermia is was being researched in University of Texas Memorial Hermann Hospital, in that setting, Dr. Bull recognized that hyperthermia stimulates the immune system to help fight cancers. It was being used in conjunction with chemotherapy. In Germany, they use it as standalone treatments, or with dendritic cell transplants, or with other non-toxic modalities. This is one of the methods they use to generate fevers. This is the Iotherm 1000. It's got an infrared light that goes from underneath to heat the patient up. The Germans, they're the engineers, and they know how to get the best performance from infrared lamps, because when you make an infrared lamp, it makes ultraviolet and infrared. You want to filter out the ultraviolet. How do you do that? Well, in Arizona, in the desert, you can be out in the sun for a few minutes, you get a sunburn. But you can be out in Maryland and be out there a couple hours, you may not get a sunburn. I said, what's the difference? It's the same sun. Well, the difference is it's ultraviolet that causes sunburn, and water filters out the ultraviolet light. And in Arizona, there's no water in the atmosphere, and the ultraviolet comes down very heavy. However, in Maryland, you got a lot of water filtering out the ultraviolet, and so it's safer. So what the Germans do is they take the infrared lamps, and they take 2 pieces of glass, put a thin layer of water between them, and that becomes their filter. They put that in front of the infrared lamp, and it filters out the ultraviolet, so they get a purer infrared lamp, and that's what they use in these. By the way, they are not approved in the US yet. You have to get the standard infrared lamps. This is the other brand in Germany, the Heckel HT3000. It is the brand out of Germany, and it has lamps on the top shining down. And I was actually able to see one of these, which is kind of an interesting story. We helped a guy. He was a real soul winner. he had been in drugs and everything his younger days, and then he gave his heart to the Lord, and he would share DVDs, spiritual DVDs with anybody. He'd go into Walmart with these spiritual DVDs. He'd see someone looking at the DVD rack, and he'd say, "You seen any good DVDs lately?" And the guy goes, "Nah, they're all junk." He says, "I feel inspired. You'd like this one." So he'd give him these DVDs. Well, we let him stay in our mother's quarters. It's a mother-in-law's quarters behind our house. We never charged him any rent. He had a window washing business, and but very outgoing guy. And then we moved away. We started working at lifestyle centers, and we lost track of him eventually. About a year later, we heard that he had married a Chinese businesswoman, a multimillionaire, and she had breast cancer. So he was taking her over to Germany. And he says, "Dave, you want to come see what they're doing? I'll fly you over there." I said, "Yeah." And so I said, it pays to be nice to people. You never know what's going to happen. So I got to see this in practice. And the interesting thing was, when she was at that high temperature, I said, "Are you uncomfortable?" She says, "No." These are much better tolerated than the water baths that we typically use here. Water baths are still effective. It's just that's a little more comfortable. How we do water baths, you almost need to be trained or go to a lifestyle center to see how they do it. But generally, you turn your thermostat up on your water heater in the basement, 150 degrees or so. And then the temperature here is about 110 to 112. A patient gets in there, you monitor their temperature, you shoot for 103 or 104 oral temperatures. You try to hold that there for 20 minutes in the tub, then pull them out and hold the temperature up, wrap them in blankets for another 20 minutes. That's optimal. But if a patient is cachectic from cancer, they have no energy reserves, can't do it. Or if they have heart disease and can't exercise, can't do it, because a fever bath is like climbing a mountain. So you just need to be a little bit careful on that. We can also give them oxygen, because as their metabolism races, oxygen saturation can drop. You need a little pulse oximeter to keep it above 90. You can use a nasal cannula with a oxygen concentrator to help do those. But generally at Lifestyle Center, we have patients come. They have to bring a helper, and we train the helper how to do these at home so they can continue doing the process at home. We do 3-day intensives where we do cancer support at our office, and we also do treatments in Heartland Lifestyle Center. See if I have their address here. Anyway, so if and at Heartland, we also want you to bring a partner so they can be trained to continue the process longer. The things that are done at a lifestyle center, you learn how to do the vegan, oil-free cooking, show you how to do the pressed juices we talked about first day. We do the intravenous vitamin C, which didn't have time to cover this series. We do the hydrotherapy, the fever baths, show you how to do those. There's some supplements that we include. The idea is we try to train you so you can continue the process at home. We get patients that are taking chemotherapy. We get patients that decide not to do chemotherapy, patients that are planning to do chemotherapy. This is what we share here is an adjunct to whatever course you're planning to do. And so we just try to support the immune system and give you support for whatever method that you and your oncologist or private physician are planning to participate in. That's it. Any questions?
Okay, well, thank you. Thank you very much for that. And got a question right here. All right.
In the very beginning of the lecture, you talked about infection, and you suggested that you could have an infection you could have a fever in the absence of an infection. I was wondering how that happens.
If you've got a stroke or something that you've got a dysfunction in your hypothalamus, a thing that adjusts your thermostat, that can happen. Dehydration can do it. You can get like a heat stroke or something like that. That can cause it as well. It's not a very, I've taken care of some intensive care patients. It's not a common thing that we see in the intensive care unit. I mean, they got to really be sick if their brain is not functioning. I mean, they've got to, they're probably terminal at that point. But yeah.
Okay, another question. Question right here, Doug.
So on these fever treatments, how many sessions are recommended? And what's kind of the duty cycle, or how often do you do them?
Yeah. The most frequent is usually every other day. But it has to do with the patient's physical condition. We had a patient who was a couch potato, you might say, and we put them in, and they got their temperature way up, 105 even. We're not supposed to get that high. But they can become delirious at that point. The oxygen saturation drops, and when the saturation drops, there's almost a program in your head. You start confessing your sins. You're getting ready to die. I mean, you laugh at it, but it's real. It really is real. I said, no, really? Yeah, really. But to avoid that, you can give oxygen. But in this patient's case, she got out of that, and she was wiped out for a couple of days. We could only do maybe once a week. She had a friend who also had cancer, and she ran every day. And when she got in the fever bath, she says, oh, this is nice. And she started reading a book. So your physical condition really makes a difference. It's kind of like climbing a mountain. Some people, no problem. Some people are really huffing and puffing. But the nice thing about fever treatments, just like climbing a mountain, is you adapt to it. And we found people adapt to fever baths even after the very first one. They may have really trouble with the first one, but the second one they do much better at. At Heartland Lifestyle Center or at our 3-day intensive in our home, we usually do one every other day, and that's usually what most people can handle. And how long do we do it? You do it basically, a normal schedule is probably reasonable schedules like twice a week, and you do it until the fever, or we have evidence that the cancer's gone, and so it can be a prolonged thing. Unfortunately, treating cancer is not a sprint. It's usually an endurance sport. It takes a long time. But yeah, those are excellent questions. By the way, if you want to get an oxygen concentrator, you can get one by prescription, or a lot of people will have, grandma and grandpa have passed away, and they've got this oxygen concentrator, and they will, Facebook, they'll sell it pretty cheap. So, yeah, that's it.
Another question. One in the back here.
Do you ever recommend fever baths for like prophylactic, like once somebody is in remission, to help reduce recurrence at all, or with no active cancer in the body, it's maybe not?
Yeah, no, fever baths are great as prophylaxis. It's just, if you experience them, you're going to realize they're uncomfortable, they're time-consuming, and they require a lot of effort. And so it's you really kind of got to be motivated to want to do them. But it's kind of like exercise. So there are other forms of fever baths. Fever baths are the ones that will get your temperature up, usually in about 20 minutes. People say, well, can I do a sauna? So, well, you can do a sauna, but our experience with saunas is because the specific heat of the steam or the air is much less than water, it takes about an hour to get your temperature up to the target level. And so in a lifestyle center where your time is a constraint, you want to get the fever up as quick as possible. And patients generally like that as well, because it means the discomfort is less. The reason you have discomfort in a fever bath but not in a normal fever, in a normal natural fever, your thermostat is set at 102, so when you hit 102, you feel comfortable. But in a water bath, your thermostat is 98.6, and you're bringing up to 102. That makes you feel uncomfortable. It would be nice if we could find a way where we could artificially get your thermostat up to 102, and then it would be much more comfortable. So.
And I know in the practice of physical therapy, every once in a while we'll do a ice water bath for an acute ankle sprain. And when we do that, the first one, it's terrible. But the second time they go in, oh, this is not so bad. So it's a similar effect then on the higher temperatures. Interesting.
Yeah.
Any other questions?
Yeah, I've found that when I take a hot shower, I'll turn it on cold before I get out, and I'll maybe count to 60 or something, and I found that the colder it is, the faster I count. So,
Well, you'll count very, very quickly when you're here using the water in Montana.
yeah.
Any other questions? Now, we promised last night that there would be a handout on insomnia. I have that here, and I'll be leaving that in the back for those of you who want that. Any other questions before we leave? Okay. Well, Doctor, I just want to thank you so much for coming all the way across the country here and seeing
My
us. We
pleasure.
invite you back anytime.
Wow, thanks for coming. Enjoyed it. Thanks
Thank you so much.
for listening.
And thank you all for coming out. Share this information. And I think his contact, could you go ahead and put, yes.
Is it up there? Oops, there it is.
There we go.
Okay.
Okay, there's some contact information if you have not gotten that already. And they're welcome to contact you with questions.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
You get, that number on the left will get my wife's number, and she can answer your questions. So,
Very good. Thanks again.